Something happened inside North America's steel industry that no one, not even the most seasoned analysts, saw coming. One policy swing, one unexpected escalation, and one strategic countermove ignited a conflict that reshaped factories, governments, and the balance of industrial power across the continent. And as the dust settled, the shockwaves didn't just rattle markets. They rearranged alliances, rewired global supply chains, and exposed a level of economic vulnerability that had been quietly building for years. It started with what many believed was a simple show of strength. But when the numbers began shifting, when the orders stopped moving, and when the factory lines went silent, it became clear this wasn't a policy debate. It was an industrial collision, and the consequences went far deeper than anyone expected. Workers felt it first. Corporations scrambled next, and both nations, Canada and the United States, were suddenly forced to confront a new reality. The old rules of trade no longer applied. The old assumptions no longer held, and the old balance of power had snapped. But the real twist? The country everyone expected to panic didn't. Because in this story, the underdog didn't just survive, it flipped the game. And that's where everything changed. It began with a decision that seemed bold on the surface and explosive underneath. When President Trump doubled steel and aluminum tariffs to 50%, he framed it as a necessary correction, an effort to pressure Canada, punish alleged inaction, and force compliance over contested claims tied to cross-border fentanyl movement. Canada rejected those accusations immediately, calling them detached from reality. But the damage had already begun. Markets shook, traders panicked, and industry leaders realized they were staring at something far more serious than a routine tariff change. Steel prices in the U.S. shot upward. Hot-rolled coil jumped to $900 per ton in just 2 weeks, the kind of spike economists compare to a cardiac event. Factories felt the tremor instantly. Shipments stalled. Costs exploded. Detroit's manufacturing backbone took the first hit as its steel pipeline from Canada, 12 million tons annually, snapped overnight. Assembly lines slowed. 2 stamping lines at Ford's River Rouge plant went dark. Michigan's unemployment edged toward the highest in the country. Even the S&P dipped, with analysts calling the entire episode the metal recession teaser. And yet, while America stumbled, Canada's next move wasn't emotional or chaotic. It was calculated and surgical. But the counterpunch that followed didn't just respond to the shockwave. It reshaped the entire battlefield. Within 48 hours, an industrial blink, Canada launched one of the most aggressive and strategic pivots in its modern economic history. A $1 billion national steel transformation initiative accelerated overnight, replacing coal-based furnaces with hydrogen and electric arc systems. This wasn't a defensive maneuver. It was a clean tech upgrade, a geopolitical repositioning, and a commercial power play fused together. Then came the second surprise: massive quotas on steel from non-FTA nations, and a blunt 25% duty on Chinese-origin steel. Canada effectively closed its borders to global dumping and signaled something the world didn't expect. Canadian steel would no longer be the discount option. At home, a new message took hold. Canadian steel would fuel Canadian infrastructure first. Pipelines, housing projects, transit systems, and federal construction now had a domestic priority. That decision alone froze U.S. access just when Detroit needed it most. And underneath the policy language was something more powerful, a strategic declaration that Canada was stepping away from its old role as America's industrial safety valve. This wasn't retaliation through tariffs. This was re-engineering the entire system. But the biggest shock wasn't domestic. It came from across the ocean. While American factories scrambled for alternatives, Europe saw an opening and rushed through it. Canada's steel, already among the cleanest in the world, suddenly qualified for the EU's incoming CBAM standards. That meant Canadian mills could sell into Europe without paying carbon penalties. For European buyers, this wasn't just convenient, it was gold. Orders poured in, contracts shifted. Ports that once handled U.S. cargo now moved Canadian slabs, coils, and billets. European industries didn't view Canada as a replacement. They viewed it as an upgrade. Cleaner, faster, more stable, and aligned with a future where emissions would dictate who gets to sell and who gets shut out. While the U.S. wrestled with shortages, Canada charted a profitable new path, one that bypassed the political storms and embraced long-term strategy. And as those deals locked in, Detroit's situation grew more desperate. Because the pain waiting in America's industrial heartland was far deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Detroit has survived recessions, bankruptcies, global competition, and technological revolutions. But nothing prepared it for a crisis that struck at the core of its operation: supply. Ford warned Congress its losses would cross $2.5 billion. GM and Stellantis watched material costs surge at a pace their pricing teams couldn't keep up with. Every F-Series truck required a ton of steel. With prices spiking by the hour, each moment became more expensive than the last. Dealerships felt the shock next. Vehicles jumped in price, $1,500, sometimes $2,000, with no relief in sight. Mexico-built models soared even higher due to tariff impacts on materials flowing through the continent. Then the crisis spread. Oil drillers in Texas couldn't secure the pipe they needed. Contractors paused projects with no timeline for resuming. Smaller companies evaporated under cost pressure. When Congress intervened, the response they received from Canada was polite but firm. Quotas only, nothing more. No reopening of the pipeline, no special exemptions, no relief. It wasn't punishment, it was strategy. But while nations negotiated, the people who make those industries run faced a different kind of fallout. Behind the scenes, Canada wasn't just reacting. It was rewriting its industrial identity. A made-in-Canada steel mandate took hold nationwide, ensuring domestic metal built domestic infrastructure. Provinces layered on their own rules, with Ontario demanding Ontario-melted steel for pipelines and Alberta reinforcing local supply lines. Exports shifted dramatically. U.S. shipments, once the dominant destination, fell from 75% to 68%. The remaining volume moved to Europe, Japan, and India. Markets more stable, more predictable, and more aligned with clean tech priorities. Meanwhile, Canadian mills secured long-term contracts, some stretching into 2027. The nation's power grid, hydro, nuclear, and renewables, became a silent competitive advantage, making Canadian steel cheaper to decarbonize and more attractive internationally. For decades, Canada was seen as America's industrial junior partner. This crisis ended that perception overnight. And while the strategy worked on paper, it generated shockwaves on the ground. Because the factories, families, and workers living through this shift carried the heaviest weight. The political speeches, tariff numbers, and government announcements were loud, but on the factory floor, the sound was silence. The kind of silence that makes workers look at each other with the same unspoken fear. Is this how it starts again? In Windsor, the mood shifted overnight. This wasn't just an economic shift, it was a flashback. Veterans of the auto industry said the tension felt like 2008 all over again, the year everything almost collapsed. Fourth-generation workers, people whose entire families were built on Ford and Stellantis paychecks, suddenly watched overtime vanish, shifts freeze, and expansion plans evaporate. Younger workers took it the hardest. Many had just bought their first homes, started families, or finally crawled out of student debt, only to watch production slow to a crawl because steel orders from the United States had evaporated. Union leaders warned that the uncertainty wasn't temporary. It wasn't a hiccup. It was a structural shock, and nobody knew how long it would last. Across the border in Detroit, the stress was just as real. Plants that relied on Canadian steel found themselves running on fumes. Furlough notices appeared with no warning. Contractors, welders, and machinists, people who weren't even in the auto sector, lost work, simply because the materials they needed weren't arriving. Local businesses near factories saw foot traffic collapse. Teachers reported students talking about parents losing shifts. Mortgage advisors said panic calls were becoming normal. And the strangest part? This fracture wasn't caused by a recession, a pandemic, or a market crash. It was caused by a single policy swing. A tariff justified by claims many workers on both sides openly questioned. Families who once counted on cross-border stability suddenly realized how fragile the lifeline really was. Jobs, savings, plans, futures, everything felt suspended. And as the emotional weight settled in, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a trade dispute anymore. It had become personal. When the dust finally began to settle, one question echoed across boardrooms, factory floors, and political circles. Did anyone actually win this fight? On paper, the tariff blitz was supposed to protect American jobs and force Canada into submission. But the reality that unfolded looked nothing like the script Washington expected. Instead of scrambling, Canada reorganized. Instead of panicking, it pivoted. And instead of collapsing, it climbed into a position it had quietly been preparing for all along. With clean steel, long-term European contracts, CBAM advantages, and a newly diversified trade network, Canada didn't just absorb the blow. It used the moment to sever its dependence on a single market. It turned vulnerability into leverage. Meanwhile, U.S. automakers suddenly found themselves fighting a two-front battle, crippling shortages today and looming carbon penalties tomorrow. The once smooth, seamless Windsor-Detroit industrial artery now feels like a relic of a past era, blocked by tariffs, overwhelmed by shortages, and overshadowed by a global shift toward clean production. Canada didn't retaliate with noise, threats, or political theater. It retaliated with strategy, and strategy won. And that raises the deeper, more uncomfortable truth. Protectionism can shield industries for a moment, but it cannot reverse global trends. The world is moving toward cleaner, cheaper, lower-emission manufacturing. Europe has already set the rules. Asia is racing ahead. Investors are placing their bets accordingly. And Canada, through timing, preparation, and clean energy advantage, just happened to be positioned for the win. So the final question isn't whether Canada beat the United States in this round. It's whether America is willing to adapt before the damage becomes permanent. Because once global supply chains rewrite their loyalties, they rarely go back.